Now, we've already talked about creative writing in the previous video, but today we're going to be examining some further tips to increase the flow of your writing and to get the ideas going in your mind. The first suggestion is to create a writing idea bank. This concept allows you to be prepared for any exam situation, because in an exam, you not only have to answer a question based on what you want to write, but respond to a stimulus and answer a question which perhaps specifies a sub-theme of your area of study. So, it's important that you have one complete story prepared and well learnt, close to being memorized. In addition to that, you should have a bank of characters, settings, motifs, and plots. And this will allow you to always be familiar with what you are writing about in an exam situation. This means that you'll never have to be thinking of things off the top of your head, but you can fall back on the things which you've prepared previously. Automatic writing is a further strategy which you can use to practice and prepare for exams. There are often situations in exams where you see a stimulus or you see a question for creative writing, and this does not fit the story which you've prepared. Now, this is a situation referred to as blanking. A student might become a bit afraid and apprehensive to answer the question because it doesn't fit the story which they've memorized. So, you can either use the technique where you fall back on your creative writing bank, or you can use the technique called automatic writing, or ghosting, where the ghost inside you take over and you write everything that comes to your head until you come up with a coherent story and something to write on. This will ensure that any thoughts that come into your head are written down on the page even if they aren't edited. This builds up the discipline of writing and means that something is on the page. So you can either do this as a practice task to get your mind flowing, or as a last case scenario in exams when you just need something written on the page to demonstrate to the marker. It's important when you do creative writing that you don't just write the story which you've prepared, because as great a story as it might be, if it doesn't fit the stimulus and the question, you're simply not going to get the marks for it. It's important that you use the stimulus to inspire you to start your writing, or work in the stimulus into your story, perhaps as a motif throughout the story which you've already prepared. You need to look at the image, or the quote, or the poem, and deconstruct it. If it's an image, you're not just describing what you see, but rather using it as a metaphorical guidance to your piece. Also, you don't just have to write your stories about people. You can make your basis of your story an animal or an object. If anything like that's mentioned in the stimulus, you can think of interesting and creative ways to turn the stimulus on its head and give the marker an interesting story which they haven't read before. So, if you look at this picture, you might ask yourself, who is this man? What's his job? What are his interests? What's his family like? These are sort of questions which mean you're looking deeper than just what he looks like, but actually what sort of a man he is. That's the character development which gets your story going. You also need to create a sophisticated setting. Now, we looked at creating a setting in the previous video, but this is a way in which you can improve the realistic nature of your setting. You can ask yourself a number of questions in order to ensure that you have a good setting for your creative piece. For example, is my setting a fictional or a non-fictional place? How big is the setting? For example, how will the setting, feeling impact your story? Also, you must ask yourself, is your setting fictional or non-fictional? The Board of Studies prefers realist writing rather than fantasy, and this is often just because realist writings are written the best, because they're the most authentic and realistic. If you're writing things about your own world and your own experience, your story is obviously going to be a better quality than writing about something that's either researched poorly or imagined up on the spot. You need to make sure you've been to your setting and really know what it's truly like, or otherwise have done extensive research into the place. You must have well thought out details of the place if you're using a non-fictional location. This is to ensure that your story isn't littered with inconsistencies and non-truths, and it's just a way to make your story stand out to the marker. You also must be sure to include details, and this way of describing things and using language techniques is a really good way to make your story more interesting and more sophisticated. For example, picking up tiny things in your setting will make sure you look like you've concentrated more on detail, and it's these minute little things which are going to make your story at the end of the day a better one. You must ask yourself, how big is the setting? Now, the size of a setting in your story is really important because you need to balance a small setting, which is manageable and easy to write about, with something that has enough scope for a story to actually occur there. So something like setting it in the whole world or even a whole country might be too difficult because in a short story, in 1,000 or so words, there's only so much you can address. It might be better instead to address a community or village, a neighborhood, or if you're really into detail and descriptive writing, even a house or just a room in a house. You also need to consider the impact of the feeling of your setting on your wider story, and you can really use the setting as a representation of your area of study theme. For example, is the setting overwhelming, scary, busy, and modern? If I was studying belonging and I wrote a story about a girl who moved from the country to the city, the setting here would really impact this because I can use an overwhelming and busy setting as a wider symbol of the girl's alienation. Is the setting comforting, safe, and familiar? If my story was about belonging and I was writing about the relationship between a mother and son when they're reading a story at bedtime, this would be a really good example of expressing belonging to a family and relating back to my area of study theme. Is it boring, constrictive, or limiting? For example, a man working in an office and feeling like he doesn't belong to his artificial surroundings. Is it exciting, new, and challenging? Such as an astronaut traveling to another planet and feeling like he belongs to something wider than his own Earth. Is it sinister, dark, and mysterious? Such as someone realizing perhaps that they don't fit into humanity and have different ideas. These are all ways in which belonging, or any area of study, can be inherently linked and symbolically linked to the nature of your setting.